Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Mercer called her when he didn't think anyone was listening. Margaret Walsh stood in the break room at Seattle General in Savannah, pouring lukewarm coffee into a ceramic mug with the hospital logo faded to almost nothing, and she heard his voice carrying through the cracked doorway. Just a nurse with shaky hands and a degree from some second-tier program nobody's heard of. The other staff members laughed. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply finished pouring, set the pot down with deliberate care, and walked back toward the patient floors with her scrubs hanging loose around her frame, 2 sizes too large, a fact Mercer had already weaponized in at least 3 separate conversations with the nursing director. What he didn't know was that those scrubs hung that way by design, that the trembling he'd observed in her hands wasn't nervousness but the careful containment of muscle memory developed over 15 years in operating theaters where the only anesthesia was morphine and the only light came from a headlamp mounted to a titanium helmet. What he didn't know was that Captain Margaret Walsh had once sutured a femoral artery laceration with equipment salvaged from a destroyed fire base in Kuna Province, using fishing line and focus and the kind of composure that only came from having already stared directly into the worst outcome and refusing to blink first. The 7th floor of Seattle General smelled like antiseptic and something else underneath, decay masked by industrial disinfectant, the smell of bodies fighting to stay alive. Margaret moved through the corridor with measured steps, her badge clipped to the oversized scrubs hanging at her waist, and she didn't acknowledge the nursing assistant who stepped aside to let her pass. The fluorescent lights above hummed their relentless hum, a sound she'd learned to filter out years ago, the same way soldiers learned to filter out the constant frequency of helicopter rotors. She'd been at Seattle General for 3 years now, moving through these hallways like a ghost that someone had forgotten to lay to rest, keeping her eyes down, keeping her hands steady when they needed to be steady, and accepting the quiet contempt that radiated from Dr. Mercer whenever they crossed paths as though it were simply part of the job description. 3 years. 1,095 days. And not once had she considered walking away. Jackson's room was at the end of the hall, room 712, and she could see through the partially open door that he was awake, staring at the ceiling with a particular exhaustion that came from being trapped inside a body that no longer answered to commands. The paralysis had set in after the IED strike, incomplete lower motor neuron damage, the chart said, words that meant nothing compared to the reality of what happened when a 28-year-old Army Ranger's spine broke at L3 and L4 and the electric impulses stopped traveling south. He'd been at Seattle General for 4 weeks now, transferred from Walter Reed after the initial acute phase stabilized, and Margaret had been assigned to his care rotation since day 3. She knocked softly, 2 raps against the doorframe, and pushed the door open wider. "Morning, Jackson. How's the pain at this hour?" She moved to the bedside with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, her hands already checking the 4-line, noting the color of his urine in the catheter bag, scanning the monitors without looking directly at them. The ECG traced its steady rhythm. The blood pressure sat stable at 118/76. His oxygen saturation held steady at 96%. All the vital signs that told her his body was still fighting, even when his mind had probably already surrendered. Jackson watched her work, his dark eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that most patients didn't bring to the task. 7, he said. Pains are 7. Phantom sensations below the L3 breakpoint. He paused. And there's a twinge in my left shoulder. Feels like it's pulling out of the socket when I think about moving it. Margaret's hand stilled for exactly 1 second. She'd read the radiology reports. She'd seen the post-operative imaging. The shoulder was fine. The shoulder was perfect. What he was experiencing was the electrical noise that happened when nerves started waking up in the wrong order, when signals got crossed and the brain received messages from places it had stopped expecting to hear from. She reached across his body and gently pressed her fingers into the anterior shoulder capsule, feeling the position of the humeral head. Dislocated anteriorly about a 1/4 inch, she said quietly. Not enough to see on the imaging if they weren't looking for it. But I feel it. She didn't ask permission. She simply repositioned his arm with the smooth confidence of someone who'd done this in field hospitals with nothing but her hands and the knowledge that speed and precision prevented shock. The movement took 6 seconds. Jackson's breathing caught for a moment, then released. How do you, he started. You're going to feel that shoulder settle for about 20 minutes, Margaret continued, making a note in his chart. Some minor discomfort as the joint capsule adjusts. We'll ice it every 2 hours for the next 48. If the phantom sensations don't improve, we'll alert Dr. Mercer for additional imaging. She looked at him directly for the first time, and something shifted in his expression. But it's repositioned now. You should feel the difference. Jackson stared at her. There was recognition beginning to form at the edges of his eyes, the kind of recognition that came from survival, from having worked alongside people in circumstances that stripped away all pretense and left only competence and instinct. He didn't know her name beyond the chart notation. He didn't know her history. But he recognized something in her, the bearing, the precision, the way she moved without any wasted motion, as though she'd been trained by someone very specific to do exactly what she'd just done, and to do it exactly right. "What's your full name?" he asked. "Margaret. I'll be back in 30 minutes to check on that shoulder." She closed his chart and stepped back from the bed, her movement smooth and deliberate. "Call the bell if you need anything. Anything at all." She was halfway to the door when Jackson's voice stopped her. "Margaret, did you ever serve?" The question hung in the air like a held breath. Margaret didn't turn around. Her hand was on the doorframe, her posture relaxed, her voice steady when she answered. "I do my service here, Jackson." "That's enough." Then she was gone, back into the hallway and the hum of the fluorescent lights, moving toward the nursing station where the day shift had begun their morning briefing. What she didn't see was Jackson's eyes widening with the kind of certainty that came from recognition, from having stood beside women who moved exactly like that, who touched patients exactly like that, who carried the particular kind of composure that could only come from having made decisions at 2 a.m. in a field hospital when the alternative was watching someone bleed out into the sand. The nursing station occupied the central hub of the 7th floor, surrounded on 3 sides by patient rooms, and Margaret was approaching it to document Jackson's care when Dr. Mercer emerged from the back office, coffee cup in hand, his expression shifting into something almost predatory when he spotted her. He was tall, 6'2", and he carried his height the way men did when they'd spent their entire lives in spaces where height meant authority, where size meant you got first choice of everything. He'd gone to Princeton. He'd done his residency at Johns Hopkins. He'd published papers in journals that ordinary nurses would never read, and this fact seemed to have convinced him that he existed on an entirely different plane of existence than the people who worked the floor. "Walsh," he called out, making her name sound like an insult. "Patient in 708 has been calling for pain medication all morning. Thinks he's dying. Probably just needs better bedside manner than we've been providing." The way he said it, with that particular inflection, made it clear that he meant her. He meant that her bedside manner was inadequate, that her presence somehow failed to inspire confidence, that she was fundamentally deficient in the way she approached patients. Margaret didn't respond immediately. She continued documenting, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same precision she'd applied to repositioning Jackson's shoulder. The keys clicked softly, the only sound she made in response to his implied criticism. At the nursing station, 2 other nurses, Sarah Chen and David Rodriguez, exchanged glances and looked away. This was the pattern now. Mercer made an observation disguised as an insult. Margaret failed to defend herself. The hierarchy remained firmly in place. "I'll check on him in 2 minutes, Dr. Mercer," Margaret said finally, her voice barely above the level of normal conversation. There was no apology in it. There was no defensiveness. It was simply a statement of fact delivered in the tone of someone acknowledging an instruction from a superior officer. Mercer smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't involve any warmth. "You do that. And while you're at it, maybe try not to tremble quite so visibly when you're in front of the attending physicians. Some of our patients find it unsettling. They start thinking their nurse is more anxious than they are." He turned to Rodriguez. "She's been shaking like a leaf all week. You'd think after 3 years she'd have settled in a bit. But some people just don't have what it takes for acute care." He walked away before Margaret could respond, the rubber soles of his Italian loafers squeaking slightly against the linoleum floor. Sarah Chen waited exactly 15 seconds before leaning toward Margaret, her voice pitched low. "Don't let him get in your head. Half the staff here thinks he's toxic." Margaret closed the chart without commenting. Her hands weren't trembling. They never trembled when it mattered. The slight vibration that Mercer had observed was something else entirely, the kind of physiological response that came from years of controlled aggression, from having learned how to keep stillness running just beneath the surface of motion, the way apex predators held perfectly still before they struck. But explaining that would require revealing why she had that particular adaptation, and revealing that would mean the entire carefully constructed existence she'd built over 3 years would collapse like a building with a compromised foundation. She stood, picked up the medication cart, and moved toward room 708, leaving the nursing station and its whispered conversations behind. As she walked, she felt the weight of the jacket hanging in her locker downstairs, the jacket with the unit patch sewn carefully into the interior lining, the stitching worn from years, the emblem faded from exposure to sun and sand and the particular grit of the Hindu Kush mountains. The patch was there in case she needed it. It had been there for 3 years. She had no idea that by the end of this week, someone would finally ask about it. She had no idea that a young paralyzed veteran in room 712 had just begun the process of understanding exactly who she was. She had no idea that Dr. Mercer's calculated campaign against her would escalate from social dismissal into something much more deliberate, much more strategic, and in the process, would create the circumstances that forced the truth into the light. For now, she simply moved through the hospital corridors with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd learned that power didn't come from being seen. Power came from being utterly, completely reliable. Power came from hands steady enough to save lives. Power came from silence. Morning rounds moved like a current through Jackson's room, his parents from Tennessee stationed on either side of his bed like sentinels, his mother's hand trembling slightly as she watched Dr. Mercer check vitals with the precision of a man who'd memorized every gesture that conveyed authority. Margaret stood at the foot of the mattress, chart in hands, watching Jackson's shoulder, dislocated 3 days ago during transfer, sitting wrong in its socket, radiating pain with every breath he took. She'd been trained to reposition such injuries under fire, in caves, in forward operating bases where the nearest surgical theater was a Black Hawk flight away. Mercer finished his examination and turned toward the door when Jackson's breathing caught, shallow and pained. Margaret moved without asking permission, her hand steady as surgical lasers, supporting his shoulder with the kind of knowledge that came from holding shattered joints together while helicopters circled overhead. She adjusted the angle with one smooth motion, knowing the precise pressure point, the exact rotation that would release the tension without forcing. Jackson's breathing deepened. The pain drained from his face. Mercer watched from the doorway, his jaw tightening as he took in the scene, a nurse, a floor nurse, doing something he hadn't done, something his hands no longer remembered how to do. He gestured theatrically at Margaret's hands, still cradling Jackson's shoulder with a gentleness that came from understanding pain at its cellular level. Well, Florence Nightingale thinks she's an orthopedist now," Mercer announced, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. Jackson's father straightened. His mother's eyes widened. The room compressed into a single held breath. Margaret's hand didn't move. Her composure arrived like muscle memory, one measured inhalation, the kind she'd perfected while interrogators shouted questions in a language she understood perfectly but chose not to answer. She turned to face Mercer, her voice arriving soft and even, following the PT protocol, "Doctor." Mercer laughed, a sound like gravel tumbling down concrete, and pivoted toward Jackson's parents with the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned by anyone he considered beneath him. "She's very enthusiastic, our Maggie here," he said, and the diminutive landed like a slap, "but enthusiasm doesn't replace actual medical training, does it?" Jackson's mother looked away. Jackson's father's face hardened into something unreadable. Margaret repositioned the pillow beneath Jackson's shoulder and stepped back, releasing her grip but not her presence. Jackson's eyes found hers for 1 second, 2, and something passed between them, some recognition that lived in the space where words couldn't go. She left the room without another word. Mercer's voice followed her into the corridor, remarkable dedication. Dangerous, though. Very dangerous. 3 days passed like a pressure system building toward a storm. Margaret worked her rounds with the same efficiency that had saved lives in operating theaters with no walls, moving through rooms, adjusting floors, repositioning patients, speaking to families with the kind of calm that made people trust her without understanding why. Then came Friday's break room, that fluorescent-lit refuge where nurses retreated between crises to reclaim pieces of themselves. Margaret lowered herself into a chair at the corner table, a sandwich wrapped in plastic sitting before her, turkey, Swiss, mustard on whole wheat, purchased at 6 a.m. before shift began. She set the chart down. She unwrapped the sandwich. Nurse Stevens stood. Dr. Patel stood. Their eyes met above the table, a conversation that required no words, and within 30 seconds the break room had emptied as if someone had pulled a fire alarm. Chairs scraped backward. Lunch trays disappeared. Conversations that had been happening, easy, casual, the kind that made hours pass without grinding, stopped mid-sentence. One by one, the table cleared until Margaret sat alone with the fluorescent light buzzing above her like angry bees trapped in a cage. She took one measured breath. Allowed herself one tear, just one, that tracked down her cheek like water finding its path down stone. Wiped it away without breaking her posture. And continued eating. The sandwich tasted like copper and ash, but she finished it anyway because abandoning it would have meant letting them take this small thing, this insignificant act of nourishment, and she'd already surrendered enough ground. By Tuesday, Mercer had moved beyond social humiliation into something more calculated, more lethal. She overheard him in the supply closet, his voice traveling through the ventilation system with the clarity of conspiracy. Maggie's got gaps in her nursing school records, just saying, I'd watch your medications around her. To the techs. The people she worked with daily. The ones who'd once asked her opinion on difficult cases, who'd trusted her judgment implicitly until 3 days ago when Mercer's poison began to work. Each word was a calculated cut, precisely placed to maximize damage. The rumors spread like infection through the hospital's bloodstream, that she'd falsified credentials, that she'd stolen medication, that her competence was a confidence game with a shelf life measured in days. By Thursday, the formal write-up appeared on the unit board for everyone to see, laminated to the cork board outside the nurses' station where no one could miss it. Margaret stood before it for 90 seconds, 120 heartbeats, reading her own professional death printed in 12-point Times New Roman, RNM Walsh, repeated overstepping of scope. Concerning behavioral patterns. Under review for credential verification. Each word had been chosen with surgical precision to maximize damage while maintaining the appearance of professionalism. Mercer approached from behind, his voice dripping with theatrical concern, the voice of a man pretending to be the only adult in a room full of children. Margaret turned to face him before he could speak, her composure arriving like a soldier returning to duty after years of civilian pretense. You'll find my record speaks for itself, Doctor. Soft. Measured. The kind of calm that came from having already survived worse things than this. What she didn't say hung in the space between them like smoke from an extinguished fire, that the military had erased that record entirely after 2019, ordered to disappear so completely that Captain Margaret Walsh officially no longer existed. No service record. No unit citations. No proof of 15 years spent healing people in places most civilians would classify as hell. The Pentagon had buried her so deep that she had no way to defend herself now, no mechanism to prove that her hands had held lives together, that her mind could process medical crises faster than most doctors could locate the relevant textbook chapter. Mercer's expression flickered, something almost like confusion, as if he'd expected her to fight back and she hadn't given him the satisfaction. He turned away without responding. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table in a small house on Riverside Drive, school permission slips scattered across the surface like evidence at a crime scene. Emma, 12 years old, walked in from soccer practice still wearing shin guards, backpack slung across one shoulder, and found her mother staring at nothing in particular. "Mom, what's wrong?" Emma asked, and Margaret couldn't construct a sentence that wouldn't require explaining things that couldn't be explained. That her job, the thing she loved more than sleep, was slipping away like sand through her fingers. that she'd come home 3 hours early because HR Director Patricia Chen had called her into the office, casually mentioning inconsistencies that had been flagged, speaking in the careful language of bureaucracy that preceded termination. She couldn't tell her daughter that an outside investigator from the State Nursing Board would be arriving next week, or that her Pentagon contact, the man who'd promised her anonymity would be protected, her service kept classified, her safety guaranteed, had stopped returning her calls. She couldn't explain that the 3 ribbons sitting in her hospital locker represented 15 years of service that officially never happened. So she pulled Emma close instead, breathed in the smell of grass and sweat and childhood, and said, "Just a long day, honey. Everything's fine." Emma, who was old enough to recognize a lie but young enough to respect her mother's privacy, nodded and went upstairs to do homework. Margaret remained at the kitchen table until darkness settled outside the windows like sediment, her hands folded in front of her, and thought about the exact moment her life had been buried the first time, not at the Pentagon, not by classified operations, but here, in Savannah, at Seattle General, where a man had decided that competence without credentials was a threat that needed to be eliminated. 2 weeks later, Margaret was checking Jackson's vitals when his Uncle Dale arrived for visiting hours, a heavy-set man from Florida with a fishing tan and lungs that wheezed like a broken accordion. He'd driven 8 hours straight, stopping only for gas station coffee, and now he was launching into some story about a boat he'd chartered off the Keys, voice getting louder, gestures getting wider, each breath shorter than the last. Margaret noted the pattern without comment, classic presentation of someone whose cardiovascular system was sending distress signals his brain hadn't caught up to yet. Jackson watched his uncle with the same attentiveness he'd learned in the Special Forces, the kind of reading a room skill that kept soldiers alive, and his jaw tightened. "Uncle Dale, you okay?" Jackson asked, voice tight, and that's when Dale's hand flew to his chest like something had struck him from the inside. His face went pale. His knees buckled. He dropped like a man whose strings had been cut, hitting the tile floor with a sound like a dropped melon, and Margaret was already moving, not running, not panicked, but moving with the kind of economy of motion that comes from 15 years of watching people die and deciding not to let that particular outcome stand. She was on her knees beside him in 3 seconds. His pulse, absent. His airway, completely blocked, vomit pooling at the back of his throat, his face already shifting toward the dusky blue of hypoxia. Margaret tilted his head back, cleared what she could with a gloved finger, and the simple fact of his complete airway obstruction crystallized into a single medical reality. They had maybe 90 seconds before Dale's brain started dying from lack of oxygen. "Code Blue, room 412, she called out, her voice carrying the kind of authority that makes nurses move without question, and she was already reaching for her purse, muscle memory overriding hospital protocol, her hands finding the sanitized pocket knife she'd carried since the Hindu Kush. The blade was clean. The knife was sharp. The anatomy was exact in her mind, cricothyroid membrane, just below the thyroid cartilage, a space no bigger than a fingernail but large enough to save a life if you knew where to cut. Dr. Mercer burst through the door like someone had summoned him specifically to watch the moment his authority was about to be permanently compromised. He took in the scene, Margaret kneeling over Dale's body, the knife in her hand, Jackson watching from the bed with eyes that had already seen enough violence to recognize its signature, and something in Mercer's face shifted from confusion to recognition to pure, crystallized rage. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly, already fumbling with the intubation equipment that had collected dust in his hand since his residency ended 15 years ago. His fingers shook as he assembled the laryngoscope. Margaret didn't answer him. Answers were a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she palpated the cricothyroid membrane with fingers that remembered exactly where the anatomy lived, the space between the cartilage rings where she'd made this same cut 43 times under sustained enemy fire, the last time in a phi base that didn't officially exist, for casualties the Department of Defense would never publicly acknowledge. The knife went through the membrane like it was opening a door that had been waiting for her this entire time. The incision was clean. Controlled. A woman performing a procedure she could execute in her sleep, in darkness, in the middle of combat trauma with shrapnel in the air and people screaming. Blood welled up, but not much. She knew exactly how shallow to go, exactly where the major vessels lived and how to avoid them. The hollow barrel of a pen from Jackson's bedside table became an emergency airway, and when she positioned it through the cricothyroid opening, Dale gasped his first breath like a man surfacing from water he'd been drowning in. Color rushed back into his face. His chest expanded. His oxygen saturation was climbing. Margaret could hear it in the monitor's tone shifting from critical to merely urgent, and the code team exploded through the door with a crash cart the size of a filing cabinet and the controlled chaos of people who'd trained for exactly this moment. The surgeon took over in the controlled way of someone who understood that the immediate crisis was over, that the patient was salvageable, that someone in this room had just brought Dale's life back with 90 seconds of precision that made everyone else look like they were moving in slow motion. They rushed him to the ICU, monitors still chirping, for lines being established, a new set of hands taking over the narrative of keeping him alive. Margaret was left standing in room 412 with vomit on her scrubs and blood on her hands, and Jackson staring at her with the particular expression of a man who'd just watched someone do something impossible, while the most credentialed person in the room watched with his mouth open like he'd never seen medical emergency before. Jackson's eyes tracked to her hands, to the knife she was calmly wiping clean on a hospital-grade sanitizing wipe, to the way her breathing hadn't elevated, to the way she was already moving on to the next task like saving someone's life was just part of the morning rounds. Something clicked in Jackson's memory, a story his predecessor had told him, passed down through the 75th Ranger Regiment like legend, about a surgical nurse with a call sign, someone who'd operated out of a fire base in Cuna Province, someone whose hands had held together more lives than most trauma surgeons saw in a decade. The way she'd held that knife. The anatomical precision of that cut. The absolute absence of hesitation. "Viper," he whispered, but Margaret was already turning away, already walking toward the door, already putting distance between herself and what she'd just done. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. Because Dr. Mercer had watched everything from the doorway, had watched Margaret save a life with a pocket knife and practiced precision, and had made the calculation that would define the next 48 hours of both their lives. He stood at the nurse's station for exactly 3 minutes, his hand still shaking slightly, his mind already working through his network, already spinning the narrative, already converting an act of heroism into evidence of misconduct. At 2:19 p.m., he picked up the phone and called Richard Hastings, the hospital board president, a man he'd known for 18 years through their Thursday morning golf games at Wilmington Country Club, a man who owed him favors and who understood that certain conversations happened with the kind of discretion that left no paper trail. "Richard, we have a problem," Mercer said, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone bringing bad news with genuine concern for a friend. "One of our nurses just performed emergency surgery. Without credentials. Without authorization. Without a physician present." The words landed exactly as intended. They transformed Margaret's emergency cricothyrotomy into a violation, her medical expertise into insubordination, her saved life into a lawsuit waiting to happen. The phone calls multiplied like infection. Mercer contacted Margaret's nursing school references, discovered the gaps in her employment history that the military had carefully constructed, 3 years that officially didn't exist, classified operations that had never been documented in the civilian healthcare world, a woman who appeared in databases and then vanished, then reappeared somewhere else like she was being erased and reinstated by a government agency that preferred its heroes invisible. These gaps became evidence of deception in Mercer's narrative. These gaps became proof that Margaret had lied on her application, had fabricated credentials, had infiltrated the hospital under false pretenses. By the time the sun set on Tuesday, Mercer had already planted seeds in the minds of 3 board members, had already framed Margaret as a dangerous imposter, had already constructed a story so convincing that the actual footage, Margaret's 90 seconds of flawless emergency medicine, became the problem instead of the solution. She'd operated without supervision. She'd used a weapon. She'd violated scope of practice. That she'd saved a life became secondary to the fact that she'd done it without permission, and permission, in the language of hospital administration, was everything. The next morning, Margaret arrived for her shift at 6:15 a.m., 30 minutes early as always, and found the break room empty in a way that felt intentional. Her badge clattered against the tile floor when she hung it on the hook, the sound louder than it should have been in the silence. By noon, the formal write-up had appeared on the unit board, 5 pages, single-spaced, each word chosen for maximum damage, repeated overstepping of scope of practice. Concerning behavioral patterns. Use of non-standard equipment. Failure to defer to physician authority. The language was clinical. The tone was damning. The implication was clear: Margaret Walsh was a liability. An investigator would arrive by Friday. A review would begin. And by next week, the woman who'd spent 3 years absorbing Dr. Mercer's contempt with quiet dignity would learn that saving someone's life could cost you everything. The investigator arrived Wednesday morning before shift change, clipboard in hand, her eyes carrying the flat effect of someone trained to find lies in paper trails. Dr. Browning from the State Medical Board. She'd cleared her calendar for this. Mercer had made sure of that. One phone call to a friend in administration, one quiet suggestion that Margaret Walsh's credentials didn't hold up to scrutiny, and suddenly the machinery of institutional power began to turn. Margaret was in room for 12 when Patricia Chen found her, helping an elderly patient with morning vitals, her hand steady as she adjusted the blood pressure cuff. "Margaret, can you step out for a moment?" Chen's voice was apologetic, which was worse than if it had been cold. The investigation folder waited in a windowless conference room on the 3rd floor. Browning didn't look up immediately. She let Margaret stand for 8 seconds. Margaret counted them, a habit from interrogation resistance training, before gesturing to a chair. "Your employment history has some gaps," Browning began, spreading papers across the table like cards in a rigged game. 15 years unaccounted for. No W-2s. No tax records. The school you listed as your nursing credential source shows you on the rolls, but nothing beyond that. Margaret sat with her hands folded on the table, a position of apparent vulnerability that was actually optimal for rapid movement if needed. "I served overseas," she said quietly. "In roles that required classified status. I was ordered not to maintain civilian employment records." Browning's pen hovered. "You were a military nurse." "I was," Margaret said. Each word measured. Each word true but incomplete. "And you have documentation of this?" "No, I was ordered to have no documentation. Those years don't officially exist." The investigator leaned back, and Margaret watched her make the calculation. This woman would check the Department of Defense records, find nothing, and conclude that Margaret had fabricated an entire military service to cover employment gaps. Browning didn't know that the Pentagon had erased Captain Margaret Walsh from every database that a civilian investigator could access. She didn't know that Margaret had spent 3 tours in the Hindu Kush treating casualties in Phi-base medical tents, that she'd earned 2 Purple Hearts and refused a 3rd. She didn't know that Margaret had been ordered to disappear, to become no one, to never speak of the operation that had saved 14 coalition soldiers from a Taliban prison compound. By Thursday afternoon, the walls had begun to close. Mercer had done his work thoroughly. He'd called the nursing school, suggested inconsistencies. He'd contacted references, left implications in the space between words. He'd mentioned to anyone who'd listened that Margaret had performed an unauthorized surgical procedure, that she'd acted far beyond her scope, that this was a pattern of dangerous overreach from someone whose credentials couldn't even be verified. The rumor infected the staff like sepsis. By Friday, people who'd admired her quiet competence began to question whether they'd ever truly known her. Doubt is a weapon that requires no ammunition. By Friday afternoon, the escort arrived. Patricia Chen and a security guard whose name Margaret didn't ask. "You're being suspended pending the outcome of the investigation," Chen said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Your credentials are under review. We need you to surrender your badge and leave the premises immediately." Margaret removed the badge from her pocket. She'd already taken it off, already knew this was coming. She'd known since the moment Dale's uncle had gone into cardiac arrest, since the moment she'd made the choice between staying anonymous and letting a man die. She'd known the price. The walk through Seattle General felt like walking through a museum of her own erasure. Faces turned away. Staff members she'd worked with for 3 years suddenly studied their phones or their charts with intense, desperate focus. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electric song, indifferent to human ruin. Mercer stood at the nurse's station as she passed, arms folded across his chest like a general surveying conquered territory, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Margaret didn't break stride. She didn't look at him. She simply walked forward, one measured step after another, the way she'd walked across the Phi-base Viper landing zone under sniper fire, the way soldiers walk when they've already accepted the worst that can happen. The rain started before she reached her car, autumn rain that fell like applause on the asphalt, and Margaret sat in the driver's seat for exactly 4 minutes before starting the engine. She didn't cry. Crying would suggest she hadn't seen this coming. She'd seen it clearly, mapped it out the moment Dr. Mercer had decided she was a threat. What she hadn't mapped was the text that arrived at 11:48 p.m. that night, from a number she didn't recognize. Marcus Jackson's brother. "We need to talk. Call me." By Saturday, the pieces had begun to assemble themselves in Jackson's mind like a puzzle constructed from fragments. He'd watched her for 3 years from his wheelchair, from his hospital bed, from the positions of immobility that had become his permanent coordinates in space. He'd noticed things that seemed small until you lined them up. The way she'd held the knife during the cricothyrotomy, not the grip of a nurse, but the grip of someone who'd been trained to feel dress wounds under fire, whose muscle memory had been forged in places that didn't officially exist. The Pashto phrase she'd whispered to the confused Afghan interpreter last month when he'd been panicked about his discharge paperwork, "Da Koda par time K, with him God will watch over you," is spoken with the accent of someone who'd lived in Kandahar province, not someone who'd learned it from an app. The faded unit patch he'd glimpsed sewn inside her jacket lining one cold morning when she'd draped it over his shoulders, the image so worn by time that he'd almost missed it, but there it was, the distinctive emblem of JSOC's task force. And her hands. Jackson had watched those hands for 3 years, watched them move with the terrifying precision of someone who'd already held lives together in conditions that would break ordinary people. He'd seen her calm a psychotic patient with one touch to the shoulder. He'd seen her assess a trauma victim's viability in the time it took to take a pulse. He'd seen her perform an emergency surgical procedure with a knife from her purse while a surgeon froze. Jackson had spent 15 years around Special Forces operators. He recognized the breed. He recognized the bearing, the economy of motion, the absolute absence of hesitation when lives hung in the balance. He recognized Margaret Walsh. That Saturday, Jackson had called his brother Marcus, who held the rank of colonel in the Marine Corps, stationed at Camp Lejeune. They talked for 3 hours while rain hammered the windows of Jackson's room, while nurses came and went, while the hospital settled into its evening rhythm of beeping monitors and distant conversations. By Sunday, Marcus had started making calls. Real calls. Calls to people who still had access to the classified databases, to officers who owed favors to his commanding general, to the Pentagon liaison office at Walter Reed where a colonel named Reeves still had jurisdiction over JSOC operations that remained classified. The Pentagon contact who'd promised to protect Margaret's anonymity didn't answer Margaret's calls. She'd tried on Friday evening, Saturday morning, Sunday afternoon. The number that had been her lifeline for 3 years, the voice on the other end who'd told her, "If anything happens, call this number and we'll extract you," now went to voicemail that never got returned. Margaret understood what that silence meant. The Pentagon had made its calculation. Margaret Walsh was exposed. The compromised asset was now a liability. Better to let her fall, to preserve operational security, to accept her sacrifice as the cost of classified operations that would continue long after her career had ended. The quiet person in the room finally understands that the quiet is the only thing that's ever been theirs. By Monday morning, Jackson had assembled everything, the dates, the locations, the medals he'd seen glimpsed in a locker when maintenance had left the staff room door open, the call sign that had slipped out in a moment when Margaret was comforting a frightened soldier in the ER. He'd made his insistence clear to the hospital administration. If they were going to hold a hearing about Margaret Walsh, it would be in his room, and he would be present. The board agreed because refusing a paralyzed veteran's request would generate exactly the kind of attention that hospital administration wanted to avoid. What they didn't know was that Marcus had already alerted his commanding general, that a 2-star General Catherine Morrison had already decided to make the drive to Savannah, that the Pentagon had already begun assembling a narrative that would reshape this moment into something none of them had anticipated. Margaret arrived Monday morning escorted by Patricia Chen, her composure intact despite 5 days of isolation, despite the certainty of professional destruction, despite the silence from the Pentagon that had confirmed her worst fear. She wore her standard scrubs, her hair pulled back, her face blank as a field operative preparing for insertion into hostile territory. Mercer was already there, standing near the window of Jackson's room with the confident posture of someone who'd already won. The board members sat like judges in a courtroom. Dr. Browning held the investigation file. And Jackson waited in his bed, his paralyzed body a map of injury, his mind still perfectly intact, assembling the final pieces of the puzzle that would change everything in the next 60 seconds. The board convened Monday morning in Jackson's room at 8:56 a.m., fluorescent light casting everything in surgical white. Patricia Chen sat at the head of the makeshift table, folders arranged like evidence at a trial. Dr. Richard Hastings, the board president, leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who'd heard this story before, another nurse with credential gaps, another overreach, another problem solved. Mercer stood at the foot of Jackson's bed, his smile sharp as a scalpel, holding a manila folder thick with printed emails and falsified employment records. "Gentlemen, Dr. Walsh never completed her nursing program at the university," Mercer began, his voice dripping with theatrical concern. "She has gaps in her employment history that span years. 3 different references have already confirmed they have no record of her service." He paused, letting the insinuation settle like poison in water. His eyes found Margaret standing near the window, and he smiled, a predator's smile, the kind that believed the kill was already certain. "I was merely protecting our patients." Jackson's body lay still beneath white sheets, paralyzed from the sternum down, but his eyes moved. They moved with the precision of a soldier reading terrain. His jaw tightened once. That was all. The Marine colonel appeared on the tablet propped against Jackson's bedside monitor, video call already cued, his uniform immaculate even through the pixelated screen. Jackson had called him at 3 a.m. and said 4 words, "I know who she is." The colonel leaned forward, his presence pressing through the digital connection like static electricity. He pulled up a document on his end, and his voice cut through Mercer's rehearsed narrative like a combat knife through silk. "Captain Margaret Walsh, Service Number 274-89-1847, Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor." Each word landed with the weight of truth. For actions in Cuna Province, where she treated 43 casualties under sustained enemy fire, evacuating them through a minefield under her own tactical command. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the corner, its mechanical wheeze the only rhythm left. Mercer's smile froze. That's impossible," she would have, the colonel continued, his voice like a gavel, wounded in action twice. "Medically retired with full honors. Code name, Viper." Jackson whispered the word, Viper, and locked eyes with Margaret across the room. Recognition. Acknowledgement. The truth finally spoken out loud. The door opened. General James Morrison walked in wearing dress uniform and the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, that made grown men instinctively straighten their spines. He was 2-star, and when he saw Margaret, he came to attention and saluted, a formal, precise military salute, his hand to his temple, his eyes fixed ahead. The medals on his chest caught the light like armor. Margaret's 3 ribbons, the one she'd kept hidden in her locker for 3 years, finally visible in her mind, finally real in this room full of people who'd tried to erase her. "Captain," General Morrison said, and the word carried the weight of an entire career, an entire war, an entire identity restored in a single syllable. Patricia Chen's pen fell from her hand and clattered on the tile. A Pentagon liaison actually arrived, walked through the hospital doors in a charcoal suit with the kind of credentials that made hospital administrators move out of the way, and stood beside the general with a folder marked classified in red letters. Dr. Walsh's records were sealed per executive order following Operation Persistent. She stopped herself. Following classified operations in 2019. Her service is confirmed. Her medical credentials are confirmed. Her security clearance remains active at the top secret sensitive compartmented information level. Mercer stepped backward, his face draining of color. "This doesn't prove anything." She still overstepped, Carl Rodriguez wheeled a laptop into Jackson's room on a cart, and the Navy veteran's eyes were cold as a submarine's hull. Carl had spent 20 years in naval intelligence, and he'd spent the last week pulling backup files from redundant servers that Mercer didn't even know existed. "Dr. Mercer," Carl said, plugging the laptop into the room's monitor, "we need to talk about your digital footprint." The footage appeared on screen, timestamp running at the bottom, 2:27 a.m., Wednesday morning, just 3 days ago. Dr. Mercer hunched over a keyboard in the hospital security office, his fingers moving frantically across keys, clicking through menus, deleting files with the desperation of a man erasing evidence. Attempting to destroy the security recording of Nurse Walsh's emergency cricothyrotomy, Carl narrated flatly. "Which she performed perfectly, I might add." "Patient," he paused, checking his notes, "Mr. Dale Marcus, age 61, cardiogenic shock, airway compromised by aspiration. Your hands were shaking during intubation, doctor." Hers were steady. Another file opened. This one showed the timestamps of Mercer's incident reports, cross-referenced with video footage that proved he'd fabricated the timeline by 30 minutes, making it appear that Margaret had overstepped before the actual emergency occurred. The math didn't add up. The lies were visible as geometry, clean, provable, undeniable. "You falsified 3 incident reports," Patricia Chen said, her voice so quiet it was somehow louder than shouting. "This one, and going back, there are 2 others. Different nurses. Different circumstances. Same pattern." Mercer reached for the door. General Morrison stepped sideways, blocking it with the kind of casual precision that suggested he'd done this before, many times, in places where the stakes were measured in lives. "You're not finished," the general said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Carl pulled up a final file, audio this time, timestamped 3 weeks prior. Mercer's voice, clear and damning, "Richard, I need you to understand, this woman is dangerous. We need to move fast before she lawyers up. I've already contacted her references. We need to discredit her immediately." Board President Hastings heard himself being manipulated, heard the strategic calculation in Mercer's voice, and his face went from pale to crimson. His friendship had been weaponized. His authority had been used. His network had been exploited to destroy a decorated officer while he'd been made a puppet on invisible strings. "Get him out," Patricia Chen said to security. 2 guards entered Jackson's room with the kind of efficiency that suggested this too had been coordinated in advance. Mercer tried to speak, tried to manufacture some final explanation, some last manipulation, but no words came that meant anything. He looked at Margaret one final time, and she met his gaze with the quiet dignity of a woman who'd survived interrogations, ambushes, and things that had no names. One measured breath. No expression. Just visible truth. The guards led him out. The hospital's investigation expanded within the hour. By end of business Tuesday, Mercer's medical privileges were suspended indefinitely, pending a formal disciplinary review that everyone in the room understood would end in termination. The state medical board was contacted. Credentialing called. The fabricated employment history he'd constructed against Margaret was dismantled piece by piece, each lie exposed, each allegation reversed. 6 months later, Veterans Day arrived in Savannah, cold and bright, the kind of morning where the sky looks like metal and the wind carries the smell of rain coming later. Seattle General's courtyard had been transformed, flags snapping in November wind, rows of folding chairs arranged in a semicircle, a podium positioned where everyone could see, where everyone could hear. Margaret stood near the entrance wearing her civilian jacket, and pinned to the left lapel were 3 ribbons arranged in order of their earning, Purple Heart first, then Bronze Star with Valor, then at the top, catching the light, the Silver Star. Her captain's insignia was visible just above them, polished and precise. The crowd was substantial, nurses and orderlies who'd shunned her, doctors who'd believed the rumors, staff members who'd simply looked away while a woman was erased. Emma sat in the front row, finally understanding why her mother had cried that night at the kitchen table, finally able to see the weight of what she'd been carrying. Jackson sat beside her in his wheelchair, Margaret's hand resting on his shoulder, two people who'd served in the same firebase 3 years apart, both wounded by different enemies, both finally visible after years of hiding in plain sight. Carl Rodriguez stood at attention in his navy dress uniform, the creases sharp enough to cut. The ceremony proceeded with standard protocol until Margaret was asked to speak. She approached the podium, and the courtyard quieted, not the silence of fear, but the silence of attention, of respect, of finally seeing someone clearly. "I spent 15 years in places I cannot name," Margaret began, her voice steady as a heartbeat monitor displaying normal rhythm, "doing things I am not permitted to describe. When I came home, I believed I had left the war behind." She paused, and in that pause the wind caught her jacket, the medals visible to everyone now. "I learned that the hardest battles are not always fought with weapons. They are fought with truth. With dignity. With the courage to stand when everything tells you to fall." From the parking lot visible beyond the courtyard fence, a medical supply van pulled away. Dr. Mercer sat behind the wheel, the physician's coat replaced with a company uniform that paid considerably less, drove noticeably slower, and represented the end of everything he'd constructed through manipulation. He saw Margaret speaking at the podium, saw the medals on her chest, saw the respect in the faces of the crowd, and he looked away first, always looked away first now. The hospital board had discovered that he'd falsified 6 incident reports over 5 years, a systematic pattern targeting nurses he perceived as threats. His license was under review. His reputation was destroyed. His network had collapsed the moment the first lie was exposed, each ally distancing themselves, each friend who'd vouched for him now claiming they'd never known. The Commonwealth attorney was still deciding whether to file charges for obstruction of justice. Patricia Chen presented Margaret with a formal commendation from the hospital, reading the citation, for exceptional medical skill, unwavering integrity, and quiet heroism in the face of professional adversity. The applause was thunderous. When it finished, Margaret and Jackson remained in the courtyard while the crowd dispersed back inside, the flag still snapping in the wind, the sky still bright and cold and unforgiving. "You saved my uncle's life," Jackson said, his voice carrying the rasp of a man whose lungs had to work harder now. "You saved mine," Margaret replied, her hand steady on his shoulder, "by remembering who I was when I couldn't prove it." From the nursing station window on the 3rd floor, Nurse Stevens and Dr. Patel watched, shame written across their faces, finally understanding what they'd been too afraid to see while it was happening. Margaret looked at Jackson as the November light caught her medals, and she spoke the truth that had taken 3 years and one terrible accusation to finally surface. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. If you've made it this far, you've witnessed what happens when someone's truth finally breaks through the lies. Margaret's story is real, not her name, not her hospital, but the experience of being invisible while carrying everything. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the people who serve us quietly, whose strength we overlook until the moment we desperately need them. Like this video and comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?